That November night in 1922 had every reason to be just another forgotten evening among so many others. She could have stayed right there, standing on the edge of that muddy, red clay mountain road, all alone with the freezing rain running down the back of her neck and a fear that weighed far more than any suitcase, waiting for a dawn that felt entirely too distant to be real. And he could have kept right on riding, this man with hunched shoulders and a hard gaze. He could have looked out the carriage window at that soaked figure on the side of the road and decided she wasn't his problem, just as he had decided 5 years ago that a whole lot of things were no longer his problem. But on that November night in 1922, something in the universe decided to step in without asking for permission. And it was exactly at this crossroad, between her utter helplessness and his heavy silence, that the most beautiful love story the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina ever held in their ancient stone heart began. Have you ever imagined what it is to be truly afraid? Not that quick jolt of panic when you miss a step you weren't expecting, but the kind of fear that settles deep inside your chest and doesn't tell you when it plans to leave. The fear of being completely alone in an unfamiliar place, with no money, no luggage, and nobody in the whole world who knows where you are, with night falling and the rain turning every rustle in the woods into something that feels far bigger than it is. Can you imagine having all of that weigh on you, and still soaked to the bone, with your shoes sinking into the mud and the cold cutting straight through your wet clothes, refusing to lower your chin? This happened in November of 1922, right in the heart of the North Carolina mountains, in a region of peaks and valleys between Asheville and Marion, where winter arrived with a vengeance. It brought that dry, biting highland cold that refuses to negotiate with anyone, and the towering pines perfumed the mornings with a scent that seemed to have been there since the dawn of time. A land of ancient stone and old money, of folks who made promises and kept them, of stories that took decades to be told, because no one was in a rush to reach the end when the journey was this good. But before we go on, I need to know where you are watching this story from today. Tell me right here in the comments, city and state, because every single person who finds their way to this channel brings a little piece of the world we never even imagined we could reach. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single tale. This story still has a lot of love left to give, and you're going to want to be here for every piece of it. Let's begin. Domenico Fontana arrived in the United States from Lombardy, in northern Italy, in 1895. He brought a worn leather suitcase, a violin wrapped in faded flannel, and the quiet determination of a man who had nothing left to lose in any country. He was a musician and a teacher, two professions that in the America of that era earned you more respect than actual cash, but Domenico never complained about it with any bitterness. He had left Italy after a severe drought destroyed his family's small farm 2 years in a row, leaving him no choice but to try his luck on a continent he had read about in books, a place that seemed, in those pages at least, to be the kind of land where hard work still got an answer. He settled in Raleigh when the North Carolina capital still smelled of fresh paint and new timber, when streets were just getting their proper names and grand buildings were being invented while people were already living inside them. He gave violin and music theory lessons to the children of affluent families who wanted their offspring polished with European culture. Penny by penny, he built a life that wasn't wealthy, but it had music in it, and Domenico considered that to be enough. Perhaps it was more than enough. Perhaps it was exactly what a life needs. Rose Carter was the daughter of Virginia coal miners, and she carried the deep patience that the Appalachian earth teaches the people born to it, a patience that isn't surrender, but rather the strength of someone who knows that all things have their proper season. She met Domenico at a midsummer county fair. She danced with him without even knowing he was a foreigner, because a warm smile doesn't carry an accent. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony on an October Saturday that they both deemed perfect because nothing that truly mattered was missing. They had Cecilia in 1899 and Benjamin in 1903, and they lived in a modest house on Chestnut Street with a window that caught the afternoon sun, a kitchen that always smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and a backyard where Domenico had planted a fig tree he swore was the exact variety that grew back in Milan. Though no one could ever really check, Cecilia grew up learning, without anyone ever explicitly using these words, that beauty doesn't have to be expensive. Her father taught her this in the way he did things. It was in the way he played his violin on an ordinary Tuesday, as if it were a grand spring concerto. It was in Rose folding the linens with absolute care, even though they were the plainest cotton available. It was in the golden light that spilled through the kitchen window every afternoon for a few brief, glorious minutes before slipping away. Cecilia learned very early on to pay attention to these tiny things that carry so much weight, and this habit of seeing what everyone else walked right past became so much a part of her that she wouldn't know how to separate herself from it, nor did she want to. Her father had taught her the parlor piano before her feet could even reach the pedals. He had taught her Italian on Friday nights, offering it like a precious gift, given a little at a time so it would last longer. He had taught her the names of the constellations visible from their backyard, and the names of the fig tree's blossoms before they turned to fruit. And he had taught her, without ever saying it outright, that a woman with intelligence and dignity never needs to bow her head to anyone, not because she is better than anyone else, but because she is equal to them all, and that is foundation enough to stand tall. But life did not spare the Fontana family from its losses, and loss arrives exactly when it pleases, without warning and without asking for permission. Rose died of pneumonia in February of 1915, during a week that turned far colder than the winter justified, as if the sky itself had gone into mourning and couldn't figure out how to pull itself out. She fell ill with a fever on a Monday, and was gone before Friday, entirely too fast for anything to be done differently, entirely too fast for Cecilia to brace herself, as if life had simply forgotten to mention that preparation was even an option. Cecilia was 16 years old. Domenico didn't completely fall apart, because he was too proud and too quiet for that sort of public collapse, but a piece of him went into the ground with Rose. A certain lightness he used to carry that never fully returned. He kept teaching, kept playing his violin on Tuesdays, but the music took on a different tone, heavier and slower, as if it had to carry a much larger burden than before. Cecilia noticed this with that finely tuned perception of hers and chose not to bring it up, because there are things parents must carry alone, and children eventually learn to respect that. She simply rolled up her sleeves without a fuss. She learned to cook the pinto beans exactly the way her mother made them, deciphering the notes Rose had left behind in a leather-bound journal. She learned to haggle with the neighborhood grocer, to scrub the collars of Domenico's shirts in a way that made them last a little longer between washes, to make ends meet at the end of the month with a mathematical grit that left no room for romance. She looked after Benjamin with that specific blend of authority and tenderness that older sisters develop when they have to be a little more than just a sister. And Ben, who was sharp and knew how to read the things left unsaid, cooperated with an ease that was just part of his good nature. Domenico lived 3 more years after Rose. He died in October of 1918 from a heart condition that had never been diagnosed, because the Fontanas were the sort of people who only saw a doctor when they had absolutely no other choice left, and Domenico's heart gave him no choice. Cecilia was 19 years old. Benjamin was 15. She looked at her brother, at the house that belonged to them, at the bank account that held a lot less than she cared to admit, and she made her decision with the steady calm of someone who had grown used to making choices without a safety net. They were going to stay on their feet. In the 4 years that followed, Cecilia gave private piano and Italian lessons, took in sewing between her classes, and stretched every penny far beyond what any penny deserved to be stretched. There was something about this tight, pinched life that she refused to call suffering, because calling it suffering would be both true and an exaggeration at the same time, and Cecilia preferred precision. It was hard. She managed. The beans tasted good anyway. Ben was studious and driven, an immense relief in this difficult equation, and by 1922 he was enrolled in a preparatory academy in Rowley, his sights firmly set on law school for the following year. Cecilia was fiercely proud of her brother, an intensity she never tried to hide, and Ben received it with that mixture of profound gratitude and mild embarrassment, which is the natural reaction of a boy who is loved that strongly. It was because of Ben that she accepted the job with the Bradford family. The Bradfords were an affluent Raleigh family with money tied up in agriculture and commerce, and they needed a governess to accompany them on a trip to the North Carolina mountains. It would be 15 days, maybe 20, at their summer retreat near Asheville, organizing the household staff while the family settled in for the season. The pay was generous enough to cover 3 full months of Ben's academy tuition, with enough left over that Cecilia already knew exactly where it would go, so she accepted with no more hesitation than the time it took to ask what her duties would be, and to ensure they fell within her capabilities. Mrs. Bradford was a middle-aged woman, impeccably dressed and reasonably educated, who treated her hired help with the distant courtesy of someone who had learned the polite forms without ever learning the substance. The problems didn't start with her. The Bradfords' eldest son, Harrison, was 27 and possessed that quiet conviction common to certain men born into old money, the belief that their family's wealth gave them rights over the entire world around them, including the people that money paid for. He had started the train journey with a tone Cecilia recognized by the very first stop, a conversational style that sounded cordial but carried a heavy, demanding pressure underneath. She gave him the benefit of the doubt more than once, because she preferred to believe the best of people until the facts forced her to do otherwise. The facts forced her hand at the third stop, on an afternoon when Mrs. Bradford was asleep in her carriage, and the narrow corridor between the train compartments was empty. What Harrison tried to do was executed with the supreme confidence of a man who fully expected yes to be the only possible answer. Cecilia said no. She said it in a low voice, without theatrics, without making threats she couldn't back up. It was a no delivered in a manner that meant the matter was absolutely closed. There was a quiet dignity in the way she said it, that exact same dignity her father had taught her without words, the kind of posture you hold on to even when everything around you is falling apart. Harrison did not like it. Men accustomed to hearing yes rarely take no well, and they take it even worse when it comes from someone they believe to be in a position of dependence. When the train finally stopped at the tiny station of Pine Ridge, a speck of a town with 3 streets and a little white church 30 miles out from Asheville, Harrison muttered to his mother that there was a problem with the governess. Mrs. Bradford, a woman of comfort who lived by the law of least resistance, asked no difficult questions. Cecilia found herself standing on the wooden platform of the station, watching the train pull away with her suitcase still inside it. She had only the small handbag she had kept with her during the ride, holding barely $2 at the bottom, a silk handkerchief that had belonged to her mother, and the little notebook where she wrote down Italian phrases whenever she missed her father. The train vanished around the bend of the tracks with that specific indifference that only trains possess, and Cecilia stood on the empty platform, staring at the empty space where it had been. She took a deep breath. She counted her $2. She breathed again. The station master, Everett, was a stout, well-meaning man who laid out her situation with genuine sorrow. The next train scheduled to stop there wouldn't arrive for 2 days. There was no hotel in the village because the only boarding house was boarded up. The family that usually took folks in lived on the other side of the river, and the weather, he said, looking up at the sky with the familiarity of a man who reads clouds like a daily paper, was not going to cooperate with a river crossing. The sky over the Blue Ridge was a heavy, low, bruised grey that seemed to be physically descending, not just covering the earth, but pressing down on it like a flat, heavy palm. Cecilia knew the difference between a fleeting summer shower and a freezing mountain storm. This was the latter, the kind of rain that unpacks its bags and decides to stay. Everett headed home before the weather completely broke, sincerely lamenting that he couldn't do more. Cecilia was left alone on the platform. The main street of the village had emptied out with the rapid speed that tiny rural towns empty out when it rains. As if the sound of the first drops was a direct order, everyone naturally obeyed. She looked at the vacant dirt road, at the houses with their shutters pulling tight, at the sky that just kept coming down. There was a dirt road, Everett had mentioned, that headed toward Marion and eventually met up with the main turnpike to Asheville. Traveling it on foot in any reasonable time was impossible, but maybe a carriage or a supply wagon would pass by. It was a terrible gamble, but standing on an empty platform while a winter storm rolled in was also a terrible gamble, and at least walking gave her the illusion of doing something other than just waiting. The rain started 15 minutes after she walked out of the village. It wasn't gradual, it was like a faucet thrown wide open all at once, a deluge that turned the dirt road into a ribbon of red mud in a matter of minutes. Her small handbag was soaked through before she even had a chance to shield it. The cold, which in the North Carolina mountains in November was already sharp when dry, grew fangs when wet. It was the kind of cold that cut straight through fabric as if you were wearing nothing at all, sinking directly into your bones with a brutal efficiency that leaves no room to ignore it. Cecilia walked with her head bowed against the wind. Her leather shoes sucked at the mud with a heavy, wet sound at every step. She thought about Ben, who would probably find a grim humor in this whole mess if he knew, and who she would make pay dearly for laughing once she finally got back to tell him. She thought about Mrs. Bradford snoring peacefully on the train as the carriage rolled toward Asheville with her suitcase in the baggage car. She thought about Harrison with the kind of brief, hard thought we reserve for things that deserve nothing more. On a stretch where the road took a wide curve and the embankment on the side dropped off steeply, she stepped in the wrong spot. A loose stone, slick with wet clay, gave way beneath her foot with an absolute betrayal to her knee, and she pitched sideways. She slid a good 5 feet down the muddy bank until she finally came to a stop in a shallow depression where the icy water had already formed a dark, freezing pool. She lay there for a second, taking stock. Nothing broken, just a scrape on the palm of her left hand, where she'd frantically tried to grab a root on the way down, and a state of complete, dripping misery that made any distinction between her clothing and the puddle purely theoretical. She sat there in the mud on the embankment for a moment longer than she needed to. The rain came down without an ounce of mercy. The darkness was closing in much faster than she cared to admit. And for the very first time since the train had left her behind, the real fear arrived. Not the small panic of temporary discomfort, but that other fear. The one that sets up camp in your stomach and feels exactly like a cold stone. Cecilia Fontana, 23 years old, daughter of a Lombard musician and a Virginia miner's girl, sitting in the freezing mud of a dirt road in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, with $2 and a ruined notebook in her purse. Had absolutely no idea what to do next, and that was when she heard the heavy thud of hooves on the road. The carriage was heavy and enclosed, pulled by 2 sturdy, dappled horses that stepped with the cautious grace of animals well trained for treacherous mountain passes. The coachman, Jeb, a man with snow-white hair who had been driving carriages for so long he looked as though he'd been born for that specific wooden bench, spotted the dark shape down the embankment and raised his right hand, calling for a halt before making any decisions. Arthur Vance cracked open the carriage window with barely contained impatience. He knew Jeb only stopped the horses when there was a genuine reason. But even so, the absolute last thing he wanted on a night like this was a complication. He had spent 2 grueling days in Asheville sorting out a land deed dispute at the county courthouse, and dealing with anything involving a courthouse in 1922 turned into days of having your patience violently tested. He was freezing, his jaw was tight, and he was more than ready to just be home. The figure down the bank was a young woman. She was soaked to the bone, with a gash on her palm that the mix of blood and rainwater made look much more dramatic than it likely was. And she was trying to stand up with a level of pure composure that the pathetic circumstances made entirely extraordinary. Arthur stared for a second that lasted longer than it needed to. It was her posture that stopped him from telling Jeb to just drive on. Anyone else, sitting in that mud, in that freezing downpour, would have had the look of someone who had wholly surrendered any pretense of dignity. This woman was attempting to rise from the slime as if she were excusing herself from a polite parlor chair. There was something in that stubborn refusal to break that pierced, without asking permission, straight through the thick armor of indifference he had been meticulously cultivating for 5 years. He stepped out of the carriage without entirely understanding why he was doing it. Cecilia saw him when he was already standing at the edge of the road, extending a hand down the muddy bank. He was tall, wearing a heavy dark coat that the rain had already turned nearly black, with an expression she couldn't quite place in the fading grey light, but it wasn't hostile. She hesitated for just a second, the exact time required to assess the threat. He waited, without any forced impatience, and he didn't pull his hand back. She took it. His hand was warm, despite the freezing air, and firm with that specific strength of a man who knows exactly how much force is needed. No more, no less. Within seconds, she was standing upright on the edge of the road, looking up at a man with dark brown eyes and brown hair that showed the very first traces of silver at the temples. He was looking back at her with an expression she could only describe as evaluative, not judgmental. Evaluative, which is an entirely different thing. He asked her where she was heading. Cecilia gave him the bare bones, the station, the train, the luggage, the road. She stated it plainly without any dramatic frills, because some deep instinct told her this was the sort of man who preferred raw facts over a sob story. He listened without interrupting, with the rare attention of someone who is genuinely hearing you, rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, he stood in silence for a moment. The rain kept coming with the brutal obstinacy of a mountain winter storm. Night had finally fully decided to fall, and the dirt road looked much darker and far longer than it had in the daylight. Arthur Vance told her he was heading up the road toward Marion, and that she could climb in if she wanted to. He said it with the flat neutrality of a man offering a favor who has absolutely no intention of collecting gratitude for it. Cecilia realized with that inherent ability she had to read the tiny details that he was deliberately making it incredibly easy for her to accept without feeling like she owed him, and that disarmed her far more than any flashy display of gallantry ever could have. She said thank you and climbed into the carriage. The interior of the carriage smelled like old leather and something faintly woody, cedar perhaps. There was a thick wool blanket folded neatly on the seat, which Cecilia looked at but didn't touch, because she was far too soaked to be polite to someone else's dry fabric. Arthur climbed in right behind her, sat on the opposite bench, and knocked his knuckles against the wooden roof, the signal for Jeb to move on. For about 10 minutes, neither of them said a word. The rain hammered against the carriage roof with an irregular rhythm that was almost comforting, and the gentle, swaying gait of the horses on the road had the cadence of something inviting you to rest. Cecilia stared out the small window, where there was nothing to see but pitch black and driving rain, and focused all her energy on trying not to shiver visibly. She was freezing, but she vastly preferred not to show it. It was Arthur who spoke first, without looking directly at her. Using that particular voice, she would later learn to associate with the moments when something deeply real was happening just beneath the words. He asked if there was someone waiting for her in Asheville. Cecilia said no. She explained that her employment with the family had ended before it even really began, and that now she just needed to figure out a way back home to Raleigh. He asked if she had family there. She said she had a brother. There was another long pause. Arthur glanced at her, and she noticed that his dark eyes were assessing her situation without an ounce of cruelty. He told her that Marion was still 8 miles away, that there was a decent boarding house there, but that with the rain coming down like this, Jeb wouldn't risk the steep mountain passes in the pitch dark. High Ridge Farm was only 4 miles up the road. She could spend the night there. He wasn't exactly asking, but he wasn't ordering her either. He was simply laying out the reality of the geography and leaving the final choice in her hands. Cecilia said she would gratefully accept. He gave a single, short nod and went back to staring out into the dark. High Ridge Farm revealed itself first as a pair of glowing lights. 2 iron lanterns hung on either side of a heavy wrought-iron gate, and behind them stood the dark, sprawling silhouette of a grand 2-story house. It had a deep, wraparound front porch that shielded the entrance from the rain like a pair of outstretched arms. Stately dogwood trees lined the long driveway, their smooth, dark trunks recognizable even in the gloom. Even in the dark, and just passing by, Cecilia could see the outlines of a sprawling garden that must have been breathtaking in some previous better cared-for time. Jeb brought the carriage to a halt right at the porch steps with the exact precision of a man who knows every single stone in that driveway. A young farmhand, Toby, who was a light sleeper and had heard the horses from a distance, hurried out the side door holding a kerosene lantern before anyone even had to shout for him. Arthur stepped down first and turned to offer his hand, this time without the frantic urgency of the muddy road, simply out of ingrained habit or protocol. Cecilia stepped down, her feet throbbing inside her ruined shoes, and stood for a moment under the shelter of the porch ceiling, listening to the rain violently lash the yard while she was finally, wonderfully dry for the first time in hours. The feeling of safety was so profound she closed her eyes for a single second. When she opened them, he was watching her with that expression she still didn't quite know how to name. Martha appeared in the heavy oak doorway before anyone needed to call for her, which was exactly how Martha always operated. She possessed a sixth sense for human presence that she blamed on years of light sleeping, but which was likely something much older than that. She was a robust woman nearing 60, with salt and pepper hair pulled back into an uncompromising bun, wearing an apron that looked as though it were a permanent part of her anatomy. She took one look at Cecilia, made a rapid mental inventory of every single thing that needed addressing, and sprang into action with the terrifying efficiency of a woman who doesn't waste time debating what can simply be fixed. She barked at Toby to fetch dry towels. She told Arthur, with the casual authority earned through decades of absolute trust, that he was dripping all over her entryway and he needed to go sort himself out. Then she took Cecilia gently but firmly by the arm and guided her inside, much like someone bringing in a stray kitten that had been left in the rain for no good reason. The inside of the house was massive, and it carried that highly specific scent of well-preserved old homes, a rich blend of polished oak, beeswax, and a faint, distant floral note that Cecilia couldn't immediately identify, but which felt incredibly warm. The walls were thick, built of stone plastered over in white, and the heat they held was the kind that seeps into your bones slowly and stays there. It wasn't the fleeting heat of a quick fire that dies when the wood runs out, but the deep, stored warmth that ancient stone keeps like a fulfilled promise. Martha led her up to the second floor, down a long hallway to a room at the very back with a window overlooking the rear yard. It was modestly furnished, but impeccably clean. boasting a patchwork quilt in colours that reminded Cecilia of a spring garden, a braided rag rug over the dark hardwood floor, and a pitcher of fresh water on the washstand. A single candle was already burning on the nightstand, casting soft, dancing shadows against the plastered walls and making the large room feel intimate and safe. Martha asked if the young lady cared for some supper. Cecilia politely declined, saying she didn't want to be a bother, that she was perfectly fine. Martha looked at her with the peaceful, unshakable authority of a woman who has never taken a no seriously when she knew it was a lie. She stated that the kitchen had pots, and the pots had broth, and it took exactly 5 minutes to heat up on the stove. Furthermore, she added, being soaked to the bone in freezing rain with a cut hand was not the same thing as being perfectly fine. No, ma'am, it was not. Cecilia stayed quiet for a second. Then she softly admitted that some warm broth would be wonderful. Martha nodded with the deep satisfaction of someone who has just had their worldview confirmed, and marched back downstairs. The stew arrived in a heavy ceramic mug. It was piping hot with that specific rich heat of something that had simmered for hours, smelling gloriously of garlic, bay leaves, and shredded chicken that melted on the tongue. Sitting next to it on the saucer was a massive, warm buttermilk biscuit, a proper southern biscuit that Martha had decided to include without mentioning it, the kind with a flaky crust and soft center that once you taste it, you never really forget. Cecilia ate every bite slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed with the patchwork quilt wrapped tightly around her shoulders, listening to the storm rage outside and the absolute solid quiet of the great house all around her. She thought about Ben. She thought about what she would tell him about this wild night when she finally made it back home. She realized there was an unintentional dark comedy to the whole ordeal, the kind of humor that only reveals itself after the fact, when you are finally safe enough to look back without trembling. She fell asleep much faster than she anticipated, the empty mug resting on the washstand, the heavy November rain acting as a lullaby against the thick glass window. Morning arrived with that razor-sharp cold specific to the mountains in late autumn, the kind that slips right through the window pane before you even open your eyes and boldly announces exactly what kind of day it's going to be. Cecilia woke up briefly disoriented, staring up at the dark wooden ceiling beams until the memory of the previous night assembled itself in proper order. The train, the freezing mud, the carriage, the grand farm, the hot stew, the heavy quilt. She lay perfectly still for a moment, just listening to the house. A massive old farmhouse has its own unique sonic texture, different from any city dwelling. There were heavy footsteps somewhere downstairs, the distant comforting clink of ceramic dishware, the lowing of a cow that sounded much closer than cows ever sounded back in Raleigh, and the rich, dark smell of percolating coffee. The scent had marched all the way up to the second floor with admirable determination, winding through corridors and staircases without losing an ounce of its strength, as if the coffee actively knew it was desperately needed. Cecilia rose, folded the patchwork quilt with the exact loving precision her mother had taught her, tidied what little she had to tidy, and headed downstairs. She found Martha in the massive kitchen, acting as absolute sovereign over a pot of creamy grits and a stovetop coffee percolator resting on the heavy cast-iron wood stove. The firewood popped and crackled with a low, steady rhythm that served as the morning's metronome. Martha offered a gruff good morning without even turning around, simply pointing at the kitchen table with her chin. The table was covered in a red and white checkered cloth, faded from countless scrubbings but ironed flat, and upon it sat a single solitary teacup, distinctly different from the everyday mugs stacked on the Welsh dresser. This cup was a delicate blue, adorned with a pattern of tiny hand-painted darker blue flowers. It was clearly very old and clearly treated with a great deal of reverence. Cecilia sat down and returned the greeting. Martha poured the dark coffee with a remarkably steady hand that didn't spill a single drop. She stood quietly for a few seconds that carried the distinct weight of a silent evaluation. Then she said, with a forced casualness that made the information feel almost accidental, that the blue teacup was strictly reserved for folks who were going to stay a while. Cecilia looked down at the delicate blue cup and then up at Martha, who had already pivoted back to the stove, wearing the aggressively neutral expression of someone who firmly believes they haven't said anything out of the ordinary. Cecilia just stared at her coffee for a long moment. Arthur appeared at precisely 7:30, punctual with the rigid exactness of a man whose days are deliberately structured because he absolutely needs them to be. He came in through the heavy side door, already wearing thick leather work boots and a faded grey flannel jacket that had clearly survived many brutal winters, replacing the soaked dark coat from the night before. He saw Cecilia at the table, wasn't surprised, or at least didn't let the surprise reach his face, and said good morning with a polite formality. It wasn't exactly a cold greeting, but it had a built-in distance, like a tall fence constructed a long time ago and maintained with meticulous care. Cecilia said good morning and thanked him deeply for the hospitality of the night before. He told her he had already sent Jeb down the mountain to Marion at first light to check on the railway situation, and that they should have news by noon regarding a train back to Raleigh. She said thank you. A silence fell over the kitchen that neither of them seemed to know how to properly dismantle. Martha solved the agonizing geometry of the moment by aggressively serving Arthur his coffee, breaking the tension with the blunt efficiency she applied to absolutely everything. Arthur drank his coffee standing up, staring out the kitchen window toward the massive barnyard where the farmhands were already moving with that steady, rhythmic pace of men who wake up long before the sun. Cecilia watched him over the rim of her blue teacup and concluded he wasn't the sort of man who enjoyed idle morning chatter. Or perhaps he wasn't the sort who enjoyed conversation at all. Or maybe, she thought, he was the sort of man who had painstakingly learned, over a considerable amount of time, how to simply survive without it. She decided not to speculate any further without better data. Jeb returned at noon with the news, and the news was grim. The torrential rain from the night before had triggered a mudslide that completely washed out a massive section of the train tracks a few miles past Pine Ridge. The railroad crews were already out there, but the foreman estimated it would be 4 to 5 solid days before any locomotive could safely pass. Hiring a private carriage all the way back to Raleigh would take days and cost a small fortune, and the 2 crumpled dollars at the bottom of Cecilia's purse were nowhere near enough to cover that kind of math. Arthur listened to Jeb's report out on the wide front porch, wearing that same evaluative stillness he wore for everything else. Cecilia stood a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her dress. She told Arthur that she was immensely grateful for everything he had already done, and that she would figure something out, that there had to be some solution she just couldn't see yet, but it would come. Arthur slowly turned his head and looked at her. He told her there was a mountain of paperwork and house accounts that needed sorting, and that Martha had been drowning in chores without any help since the last maid got married and moved to town 3 months ago. He said that if she was willing to lend a hand while she waited for the tracks to clear, the room and board would be considered fair payment. He delivered the offer with the exact same flat neutrality he used for everything, deliberately making it very easy for her to say no if she wanted to. Cecilia understood instantly that this was an offer of pure dignity, disguised as cold pragmatism. There was a profound respect in the gesture, the rare kind of respect you recognize immediately because you see it so seldom. She said she would accept. Arthur gave a single nod. He muttered something to Jeb about checking the shingles on the equipment shed, and marched down the porch steps with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man who knows exactly where his boots are landing. Cecilia stood by the railing, watching his broad back as he walked away. Martha materialized beside her with that uncanny habit she had of simply appearing whenever something needed to be said. In a low voice, speaking almost to the chilly wind, she muttered that the boss was a good man. Cecilia replied that he certainly seemed to be. Martha retorted that seemed was exactly the right word, because the man put a terrifying amount of effort into making sure folks only ever saw the surface. She delivered the cryptic line and vanished back into the house before Cecilia could ask a single question. Cecilia carried that sentence around in her head for the rest of the afternoon. High Ridge Farm spanned nearly 600 acres of prime mountain land. They ran Black Angus and Hereford cattle, harvested massive fields of corn and feed, employed 4 full-time hands plus Jeb and Toby, and boasted a magnificent main house built by Arthur's father, Josiah Vance, back in the 1880s. It had been constructed with heavy river stone on the exterior walls, rich heart pine for the floors and structural beams, and a sweeping front porch that had hosted generations of the Vance family sitting out at dusk just to listen to the mountains quiet down. It was a highly prosperous estate, there was absolutely no doubt about that. But it carried the sterile, echoing atmosphere of a place where rigid organization had entirely replaced human warmth. Everything was spotless, perfectly maintained, in absolute, flawless order. Objects had their assigned places and they never strayed. Daily routines were executed with a mechanical punctuality that felt much more like a military protocol than a lived, breathing habit. There were hydrangeas planted by the front steps because flowers in a farmhouse yard were a social convention, not because anyone had actually chosen them out of joy. There was a beautiful, upright parlor piano in the sitting room because a piano in a grand home was a marker of culture. Yet its lid was locked shut and covered with a heavy velvet runner that clearly hadn't been lifted in a span of time. Cecilia couldn't even begin to guess. She noticed all these things within her first 2 days, driven by that lifelong habit of paying deep attention to the details everyone else walked right past. She noticed the velvet over the piano. She noticed the beautifully framed needlepoint hanging in the upstairs hallway, stitched with agonizing patience and obvious love, that Arthur walked past every single day without ever glancing at. She noticed the elegant white porcelain vases resting on the parlor windowsills, the exact kind meant to hold fresh-cut blooms, sitting completely empty. She also noticed that Arthur left the house at 6 o'clock every morning and returned exactly at 6 o'clock every evening with the grim regularity of a pocket watch. She noticed that he ate his dinner rapidly and efficiently, spoke only when practically necessary, and then vanished into his study to pore over ledgers and farm reports until 10 at night. She noticed that in absolutely everything he did, there was a freezing competence and an equally freezing absence of anything stretching beyond basic necessity. She was trying to decipher the place. Every house has its own secret grammar, and Cecilia was a woman who learned grammars very quickly. On her 3rd day, she found the back garden. It was tucked behind the main house, separated from the noisy, dusty working barnyard by a split-rail wooden fence that desperately needed repair. It was a garden that had once been sprawling and fiercely beloved. The underlying bones made that undeniably clear. There were elegant planting beds bordered by smooth river stones, winding pathways of crushed white gravel between them, and a wide circular clearing right in the center that looked as though it had been designed for a stone bird bath or fountain that was no longer there. There was a grand design here, a blueprint drawn by someone who had sat down with paper and pen and decided, with great joy and intention, exactly how this patch of earth should bloom. But it had been at least 5 years since a human hand had cared for it. The mountain weeds had aggressively reclaimed the beds with the ruthless democracy of wild nature, making absolutely no distinction between what had been planted with love and what had simply blown in on the wind. The climbing rose bushes had grown wild and chaotic without any pruning, tangling themselves into a thorny, impenetrable wall rather than a garden feature. Yet deep inside the mess There were still roses, tiny, stubborn, deep burgundy blooms that somehow managed to survive the years of crushing neglect. They clung to life with an obstinance that Cecilia found quite unexpectedly deeply moving. She stood at the edge of the ruined garden with her hands shoved deep into the pockets of the canvas apron Martha had loaned her, staring into the chaotic sea of green, just thinking. That afternoon in the kitchen, she casually asked Martha whose garden it had been. Martha went completely still for a moment that lasted far too long. Then, in a clipped tone, she said it had belonged to Miss Clara. Cecilia gave a small nod and didn't press for details, because there was a heavy, suffocating weight attached to that answer that you don't just go poking around in for fun. Clara. The name landed softly on Cecilia's mind, like a tired bird touching down on a branch without announcing how long it intends to stay. Over the next few days, Cecilia slowly pieced the story together the way you assemble a jigsaw puzzle you found in an old drawer, piece by piece, without having the picture on the box to guide you. Martha was the primary source. Not because the cook was a gossip, she certainly wasn't, but because when Martha finally decided to trust someone, she spoke with a blunt honesty that bordered on painful. And Martha had clearly decided to trust Cecilia with the exact same rapid certainty that had led her to place the blue teacup on the table that first morning. Clara Lancaster had arrived at Highridge Farm as Arthur's beautiful young bride in 1917, following a gentle, thoroughly respectable courtship. She had lived in the house for barely 8 months before a brutal bout of typhoid fever swept through the valley and took everything away in November of that same year. She had been the daughter of a wealthy Asheville merchant, a woman of soft grace and highly refined tastes. It was Clara who had brought the grand garden to the farm, Clara who had stitched the needlepoint in the upstairs hall, Clara who had placed the porcelain vases by the windows, and Clara who had played the music that the piano had kept locked away inside its wooden belly ever since, suffocating beneath that dark velvet runner. Martha said that Arthur was only 27 when Clara died. They had married in the warmth of March, and the fever took her in the bitter cold of November. Martha recounted how Arthur had locked himself in their bedroom for a solid week afterward, and how Martha had just left plates of food outside the door without knocking, because there are times when the only mercy you can offer a broken human being is absolute empty space. When he finally emerged and started functioning again, he came out different. He was closed off, sharp, incredibly precise, as if he had run the brutal calculus of grief and decided that feeling anything at all was simply a risk he was never, ever going to take again. Cecilia heard all of this late on a Wednesday afternoon, a cup of herbal tea growing cold between her hands on the table. She sat in silence for a long time. She whispered that she understood. Martha wiped a perfectly clean counter with a rag and replied that understanding a thing ain't the same as knowing what on earth to do with it once you understand it. Cecilia looked at the older woman and quietly admitted that this was also very true. Martha gave a firm nod, wearing the expression of a woman who had just firmly closed a chapter without entirely sealing the book. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Cecilia was walking past the parlour room when she suddenly stopped in her tracks. It wasn't the first time she had walked past the parlour, and it wasn't the first time the old upright piano had caught her eye from the doorway. But there was something about that specific afternoon, perhaps the way the late autumn sunlight slanted through the window pane, striking the dark mahogany varnish at an angle, as if the light were actively searching for something it had forgotten, that made her stop entirely. The grand house was utterly silent. Arthur was miles away on the upper pastures with the cattlemen. Martha was out back tending to the chicken coops, and Toby had ridden the wagon down to Marion with Jeb to pick up heavy supplies. The house held that particular heavy stillness of a working farm in the late afternoon, when the hard labor of the day is largely done, but the evening hasn't quite arrived yet, and the silence takes on the thick texture of something holding its breath. Cecilia stepped into the parlor slowly. She ran her fingertips lightly along the edge of the closed piano lid, feeling the dense velvet of the runner, noting the fine, undisturbed layer of dust that years of silence had left behind. She lifted the velvet with extreme care, folding it back over the top of the instrument with the precise respect her mother had always taught her to use for things that deserved it. The keyboard lid was secured by a simple brass latch. She clicked it open. The keys were genuine ivory, yellowed unevenly by time like the teeth of some ancient dormant beast. When she gently pressed the middle C with her index finger, the note that rang out was far more in tune than she had ever dared expect. The sound was slightly muffled by the years of disuse, but it was true, as if the heavy wood and steel strings had waited with the endless, stubborn patience that well-made inanimate objects seem to possess. Cecilia pulled out the heavy wooden stool, adjusted the distance, and rested her hands lightly on the keys with the familiar grace of someone returning to a childhood home. And she played. She played a melody her father had taught her years ago, a folk song from the valleys of northern Italy. It didn't have a name that she knew of. It was just a gentle cascade of notes that rose and fell like human breathing. It was simple and breathtaking, carrying the specific, heartbreaking beauty of things that never try to be more than exactly what they are. She played slowly, with the reverence of someone testing the acoustics of a sacred silence before daring to fill it, letting the vibration of each note settle entirely into the floorboards before striking the next. The music blew the stagnant air out of the parlor, just like throwing open a heavy window changes the atmosphere of a stuffy room. She didn't hear the footsteps coming down the hardwood corridor because she was entirely lost inside the melody. She was in that deep, quiet place of a musician playing from raw memory rather than sheet music, where the hands know the physical journey so well that the mind is free to wander somewhere else. She only realized she wasn't alone when she reached the final measure, letting the last aching chord dissolve into the dust motes with the agonizing slowness of something that desperately doesn't want to end, and lifted her eyes. Arthur Vance was standing frozen in the parlor doorway. She had absolutely no idea how long he had been standing there. But he was there, and in his rigid posture on the threshold, there was something she hadn't seen in him during the entire 5 days she had been living under his roof. It was something buried deep beneath all his meticulous ledgers and his carefully cultivated freezing distance. It looked like pure agony and profound shock warring on his face at the exact same time, the look of a man suddenly hearing a voice he had forced himself to forget, realizing that the forgetting hurt far worse than the remembering. Cecilia remained perfectly still. She didn't yank her hands off the keys in a panic. She let them slide down gracefully until they rested quietly in her lap. He stared at her for a moment that carried immense, crushing weight without making a single sound. Then he said, his voice raspy and entirely different from the flat tone he had used every day prior, that the song was beautiful. Cecilia softly told him it had belonged to her father. Arthur looked away from her, staring intensely at the polished wood of the piano for a second. It was a look that contained an entire, violent argument. But the argument wasn't with her. Then he muttered a curt, "Good afternoon," and pivoted, marching quickly back down the corridor with his heavy, echoing stride. Cecilia sat alone on the stool long after he was gone, listening to the great house slowly pull the silence back around its shoulders. But there was a different quality to that silence now. It was no longer completely empty. She didn't yet know what had filled it, but something was definitely there. The days at High Ridge Farm began to acquire their own specific rhythm, the way days always do when you finally learn the tempo of the ground you're walking on. Cecilia quickly discovered that her actual usefulness to the estate stretched far beyond the vague helping Martha that Arthur had originally suggested. There was a terrifying backlog of pantry and supply accounting that was 3 months behind, primarily because Martha was a genius with a skillet, but maintained a strictly hostile relationship with mathematics. There were torn, heavy canvas work coats belonging to the farmhands that desperately required the attention of someone with patience and a sturdy needle. There was a massive wooden inbox filled with correspondence that Arthur diligently opened, read, and replied to, but whose carbon copies had never been filed in any logical system that would allow a human being to retrieve them later. She simply took over these tasks without waiting for anyone to ask, because she possessed the rare eye to see exactly what needed fixing and a pair of hands that absolutely refused to sit idle when there was a purpose to be found. Martha observed this quiet takeover with an immense silent approval that manifested itself physically. Cecilia began finding significantly thicker slices of cornbread by her coffee cup in the afternoons, and overly generous ladles of stew on her dinner plate. It was a deep, unspoken affection, and Cecilia understood the language perfectly from the very first day. Arthur never said a single word about the flawlessly organized ledger books that miraculously appeared on his heavy oak desk, but they appeared exactly in the center of his blotter, and Cecilia noticed the very next morning that he had actually used the indexing system she created to find a receipt. That was thanks enough. The ruined back garden simply became part of Cecilia's morning routine, with the same organic inevitability that broken things find their way into the hands of people who know how to mend them. She borrowed a pair of thick leather work gloves from Toby, asked Martha to point out the rusted shears in the tool shed, and started on the outer perimeter, aggressively cutting back the wild overgrowth that had claimed territory it didn't own. The massive, tangled climbing roses took 3 grueling days of careful, bloody work, because old thorns do not forgive a rushing hand, and Cecilia respected the danger the same way you respect the boundaries of anything that is ultimately worth the pain. She pruned with agonizing patience, one dead branch at a time. Slowly, beneath the chaotic green nightmare, she began to uncover the beautiful, deliberate structure that someone had planned with so much love years ago. The elegant curved arches of the planting beds, the crushed gravel pathways that were simple but deeply intentional, the perfectly round focal point in the center. It felt exactly like excavating the ruined architecture of a brilliant idea that someone had fiercely loved, an idea that time had violently tried to erase, but hadn't quite managed to kill. On the 8th day, when she had successfully cleared half the brush and exposed the beautiful riverstone borders that had been suffocating beneath layers of dead vines, Arthur happened to walk past the study window that overlooked the rear yard. He stopped dead. She had her back to the glass. She was crouched in the dirt, wrestling a massive rotted stump out of the earth with both hands. Her dark hair was tied back tightly in one of Martha's spare kerchiefs, and Toby's oversized leather gloves kept slipping down her slender wrists. Arthur stood at the glass, watching her fight the earth for an amount of time he himself could never have accurately measured. Then he turned and walked away without uttering a sound. But he walked away much slower than he had approached. The week grew progressively colder, exactly the way November in the mountains does when it decides to remind you just how many weapons it still has in its arsenal. The nights plunged down near freezing, bringing that crystal-clear, bone-dry altitude cold that lacks humidity but possesses a terrifying, stabbing depth. Cecilia had developed a quiet habit of sitting out on the wide front porch right after supper. It was the hour when the grand house finally settled down, and the mountain sky exploded with so many blindingly bright stars it almost felt arrogant, as if the universe were aggressively showing off. She would take a book or her sewing basket and sit out there for 30 or 40 minutes in the freezing air. She had come to need that pocket of the evening just as fiercely as she needed her morning coffee. On her 10th night at the farm, she was sitting on the wooden bench, squinting at a torn seam in the dim light, when she felt a heavy, sudden weight drop gently over her shoulders. It was a thick wool shawl, moss green, radiating the deep, stored body heat of the man who had just been wearing it. She snapped her head around and caught a glimpse of Arthur's broad back as he walked quickly back inside the house, moving with his usual heavy stride, never once looking back over his shoulder. Cecilia stared at the empty doorway for a long time. Then she looked down at the heavy green wool draped over her collarbone, gently rubbing the coarse fabric between her numb fingers. It carried that faint, specific scent of dry cedar she had learned to associate with his heavy winter coats, barely there, but undeniably him. She went back to her sewing without making a sound, but a tiny, quiet smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She hadn't forced it. It simply bloomed all on its own, the way deeply honest things usually do. The next morning, before breakfast, she folded the heavy green shawl into a perfect flawless square and laid it over the back of the leather chair in his study, right next to his ledgers, without leaving a note or saying a word. It went back to being his shawl, but the gesture had happened. They both knew it had happened, and that was the kind of dialogue that didn't require a single spoken syllable to be incredibly loud. Arthur was aggressively fighting a property line dispute with a stubborn neighbor down the valley. The battle involved ancient, brittle survey maps, contradictory county deeds, and a towering stack of handwritten notes left behind by his late father. It was a nightmare to decode, primarily because Josiah Vance's handwriting was an exercise in abstract art long before it was a method of communication. On a Thursday afternoon, Arthur was standing over the massive dining room table, the only surface large enough to hold all the blueprints, surrounded by scattered papers, angrily muttering to himself about a footnote that made absolutely zero geographical sense. Cecilia was walking past the heavy oak doors, saw the frustrated geometry of the man leaning over the table, and paused. She softly asked if she could help. He snapped his head up, his dark eyes carrying an expression that wasn't exactly shock, but circled right around the edges of it. He gruffly stated that these were legal land deeds and century-old survey records. She took a step into the room and calmly explained that her father had been a teacher and that she had been reading archaic, looping cursive since she was a little girl. She added that her older students used to bring her letters from their grandparents just so she could translate the loops, and that deciphering the frantic scribbles of 19th-century mountain farmers was an incredibly specific skill she had mastered entirely by accident. A heavy silence dropped over the table. Arthur used the pause to make a decision he violently refused to acknowledge as a decision. He stepped back from the maps to give her room. Cecilia walked up to the edge of the mahogany table and leaned over the ancient parchment he was pointing at. They were standing shoulder to shoulder. She was slightly shorter, leaning in close to trace the faded ink. He was leaning in right beside her to track her finger. The physical distance between them was perhaps 4 inches. Cecilia read the loops aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, piecing the jagged letters together with the practiced patience of someone who had done this 100 times. She murmured that the footnote explicitly stated the boundary line followed the dry creek bed during drought years, but shifted to the large granite boulder during years of heavy rain. She added with a faint smile that this was a deeply Appalachian way of saying the property line depended entirely on the season and the mood of the sky, which meant it was either an act of pure genius or a total legal disaster, depending entirely on which county judge looked at it. Arthur went completely still. Then very slowly he turned his head to look down at her. In the exact same moment, she turned her face up to look at him. The distance between their faces was suddenly terrifyingly smaller than either of them had anticipated. The late afternoon sun was cutting sharply through the tall side window, hitting her eyes directly, illuminating that rich, honey-amber color he had noticed from across rooms, but had never seen this close up. Neither of them moved a muscle for a long, heavy second. It was Cecilia who finally broke the spell. She straightened her spine, pulling back slowly, returning to a neutral standing posture with a casualness she desperately prayed looked natural. She cleared her throat and said that, given the context of the deed, her translation was the only one that made logical sense. Arthur stared at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was noticeably rougher than his usual tone. He simply said that she was right. She neatly stacked the loose documents she had been holding, set them carefully on the correct pile, told him to call if he needed any more translations, and walked out of the dining room. It wasn't until she was halfway down the hall that she realized she had completely forgotten how to breathe normally for a solid minute. The mail arrived at High Ridge Farm exactly once a week, hauled up the mountain by a young boy on a mule from the nearest village, assuming the winter weather permitted the climb. During Cecilia's second week at the estate, a letter arrived from Ben. His handwriting was large and slanted aggressively to the right, carrying the messy energy of a young man still trying to figure out exactly what size handwriting matched his ambitions. He wrote that he was doing fine, that the academy courses were brutal, but he was holding his own. He bragged a little about winning a commendation in a debate tournament his professor had hosted. Then his tone shifted. He wrote that he was deeply worried about Cecilia's absolute silence, reminding her she had promised to be back in Raleigh in 15 days, and it had been much longer than that. At the very bottom of the page, in classic Ben fashion, he added a line that perfectly mixed genuine anxiety with sharp humor. He wrote that she was probably fine, because if she wasn't, she would have already found a way to haunt him. He ended by noting that the pinto beans he had taught the boarding house cook to make were getting slightly better, but they still had a very long way to go. Cecilia folded the stiff paper carefully, holding it tightly against her chest for a moment. The fierce ache of missing her brother hit her with that highly specific weight that only siblings understand. It wasn't a crushing agony, but it was a constant, nagging dullness, like a small stone in your shoe that you learn to walk on, but can never entirely forget is there. She wrote him back that very afternoon. She explained her ridiculous detour plainly and without an ounce of melodrama, assuring him she was safe, warm, and earning enough wages to keep them afloat until the railway tracks were rebuilt. She did not mention the ruined garden. She did not mention the upright piano. She absolutely did not mention the terrifying 4 inches of space over a surveyor's map. There are certain things that don't have a proper name yet, which means they do not belong in a letter. And if you are following this story and it's touching something deep inside you, please leave a like on the video before continuing, because it truly helps this channel keep bringing these beautiful tales to life. Now, let's see what happens next. Miss Eleanor Lancaster arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 16 days after Cecilia had washed up at the farm. She rolled up the driveway in a gleaming black carriage with her family's crest discreetly painted on the door, wearing an expression that had been locked into place decades ago and rarely required updating. She was 55 years old, her snow-white hair aggressively pinned back with expensive tortoise-shell combs. She wore a heavy, dark taffeta dress of impeccable quality and carried herself with that rigid posture common to certain old-money matriarchs, a posture completely indistinguishable from actual armor because it was explicitly designed to function as such. She was Clara's older sister. She was unmarried, by choice or by tragic circumstance, depending entirely on which society gossip you asked. And she had spent the last 5 years since Clara's death doing exactly what people do when they lose someone far too soon. She had appointed herself the vicious guardian of the memory. Arthur received her on the front porch with a stiff formality that was actually deep, ancient affection, translated into the only language the two of them had managed to build over 5 years of shared, crushing grief. Eleanor hugged him briefly but fiercely, the kind of desperate embrace that asks for nothing except physical proof that the other person hasn't collapsed yet. Then she swept into the house with the absolute authority of a woman who knows exactly where every floorboard creaks. She found Cecilia in the massive kitchen, elbow-deep in flour, helping Martha prep the evening bread. The terrible pause that stretched between the two women. The second their eyes met lasted barely 3 seconds, but it contained the crushing weight of an entire screaming match that neither of them was actually having out loud. Eleanor stared coldly at the younger woman and demanded to know who this was. Martha, who had seen this exact train wreck coming from 3 miles down the mountain and had prepared accordingly, answered in a perfectly smooth, unbothered voice. She stated that this was Miss Cecilia Fontana, who was graciously helping out around the farm, while she waited for the mudslides to be cleared off the train tracks so she could get back home. Eleanor let out a sharp, "I see," delivered in a tone that made it violently clear she had seen and understood things stretching far beyond what Martha had actually said. Dinner that evening possessed the agonizing, suffocating quality of a meal where every single person at the table knows there is a massive conversation not being had, and that collective awareness makes the silence between the clinking silverware so deafening that nobody can name it, but everyone is choking on it. Eleanor drove the dinner conversation with the ruthless skill of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding society dining rooms. She interrogated Arthur about the cattle yields, the corn harvest, and the irritating property dispute with the neighbors down the valley. She addressed exactly one question to Cecilia during the entire hour. Just one. But it was selected with a surgical cruelty that revealed volumes about the woman asking it. She casually asked Cecilia which Fontana family she belonged to, implying she meant the wealthy industrial Fontanas of Richmond, or perhaps the banking Fontanas of Charleston. Cecilia looked her dead in the eye, kept her voice perfectly level, and replied that her father was an Italian immigrant who arrived in America on a boat in 1895 with a worn suitcase and a violin. Eleanor let out a soft, "Ah." It wasn't overtly hostile, but it was absolute and final in its intent to categorize. It was the verbal equivalent of picking up an object and shoving it onto the exact, lowly shelf where she firmly believed it belonged. At that exact second, Arthur loudly interrupted, dropping a highly specific, complicated detail about the corn yields that violently dragged Eleanor's attention back to the farm ledgers. He redirected the interrogation with a smooth, desperate skill that proved he had practiced this maneuver 1,000 times before. Cecilia caught the entire exchange. She noticed that he had caught Eleanor's venomous insult, understood exactly what it meant, and had immediately thrown himself in the line of fire to stop it. It was a tiny, fleeting moment. But Cecilia was a woman who knew that the tiny moments were the only ones that actually mattered, because she had learned a long time ago never to discard the small things. The next morning, Eleanor hunted Cecilia down in the back garden. Cecilia was crouched in the freezing dirt between 2 stone beds, carefully pruning back the last of the stubborn rose bushes, when she heard the heavy crunch of leather boots on the white gravel path. She stood up slowly, wiping her brow, still holding the rusted shears. Eleanor didn't bother with a greeting. She went straight for the throat, because blunt force trauma was the only method she trusted when dealing with things she considered sacred. She told Cecilia, her voice dripping with ice, that she appeared to be a decent enough girl, and that was the only reason she was going to be brutally honest with her. She declared that High Ridge Farm held a sacred memory that demanded absolute reverence. She stated that Clara had loved this soil with all her heart, and that seeing it being dug up and mutilated by the hands of a total stranger was something Eleanor openly confessed she didn't quite know how to stomach. Cecilia stood her ground. She listened to the entire speech without interrupting once, her face an unreadable mask. When the older woman finally finished, Cecilia spoke. Her voice was steady, calm, and utterly fearless. She said that she completely understood what Eleanor was feeling, But she added that respecting the memory of a woman who had loved a piece of earth was not incompatible with cutting back the rot so the earth didn't die. She looked down at the thorns in her hands and softly explained that a rose bush planted with immense love eventually requires the painful bite of the shears if it wants to keep living, and that the hand holding the blade can do so with profound respect, even if it wasn't the hand that planted the seed. Eleanor stared at the young woman in the dirt, her aristocratic face contorted into an expression Cecilia couldn't easily map. There was undeniable hardness there, yes. But beneath the ice, there was something much older, much more complicated, something the cruelty was trying to bury, but couldn't quite hide from someone who knew how to look. Eleanor finally snapped that she sincerely hoped Cecilia knew exactly what she was playing at. Cecilia softly replied that there were a few things she knew for certain, and a whole lot of things she was still desperately trying to learn, just like everybody else. Eleanor spun on her heel and marched back down the gravel path with the exact same rigid armor she had arrived in. Cecilia knelt back down in the dirt and returned to the roses. Later that same afternoon, something happened that Cecilia would lock away in her chest for a very long time before she fully understood what it meant. She had walked up to the second floor to fetch an accounting ledger she had left on her nightstand. As she walked down the long, shadowed hallway, she passed by the heavy oak door of Arthur's bedroom, which was cracked open just a few inches. She didn't stop. She had absolutely no reason to stop. But through that narrow gap, in the single second it took her to walk past, her eyes caught something resting on top of the dark mahogany dresser next to his bed. It was a pair of gloves. They were women's gloves. Tiny, delicate, made of ivory-colored leather, with intricate gold thread embroidered across the knuckles. They were laid out on the polished wood with the agonizing care of a man placing a relic on a holy altar. Right beside them sat a small silver picture frame. She couldn't see the photograph clearly enough in the gloom, but she knew in her bones exactly whose face was in it. She kept walking down the hall without breaking her stride. But the image of those ivory gloves burned itself into her mind for the rest of the day, settling right next to the little stone in her shoe, the one you learn to walk on, but can never forget, is there. That night, sitting out on the freezing front porch with her sewing basket, she stared up at the stars and thought about the kind of love that forces a man to build a shrine on his dresser. The kind of love that refuses to leave and doesn't want to, because letting go would feel like a violent betrayal. A betrayal the man simply cannot commit even years after the woman is buried in the ground. She realized there were people for whom loving someone was an absolute state of being that carried no expiration date. It existed outside of time, possessing the exact same terrifying stubbornness as the dead rose bushes that had somehow survived 5 years of choking weeds because their roots were simply too deep to surrender to the rot. Somewhere deep in the center of her chest, a sudden, fierce, protective care for this broken man flared to life. She hadn't asked for it, it just arrived. The heavy moss-green shawl fell gently over her shoulders again that night. This time, she didn't snap her head around to look at him. She just kept her eyes on the dark trees, pulled the wool tighter against her neck, and whispered a soft, "Thank you," into the freezing wind, without moving an inch. There was a heavy pause behind her, a few seconds longer than the last time, before the heavy boot slowly turned and walked back inside the house. The incident with the button happened on a Thursday morning, when Arthur was preparing to ride down to Marion to finally sign the sworn affidavits for the property dispute. Cecilia was standing by the heavy front door, scribbling down a flour and sugar inventory list for Toby, when Arthur came stomping down the grand staircase. He was wearing his good coat, the heavy, dark navy wool piece he reserved exclusively for dealing with lawyers and bankers. She glanced up at him with that sweeping, habitual attention she applied to absolutely everything that crossed her path. The third button on the navy coat was hanging by a thread, literally dangling by two frayed fibers, aggressively threatening to snap off into the mud the second he made a sudden movement. She spoke before her brain could remind her that inspecting the boss's wardrobe wasn't actually in her job description. She casually pointed out that his third button was loose and that he was going to lose it somewhere on the mountain road. He looked down at his own chest with a flash of intense irritation that was aimed entirely at the traitorous button, not at her. And then, before she had made any conscious decision to do so, Cecilia was moving. She reached deep into the pocket of her canvas apron and pulled out the small sewing needle, threaded with dark cotton she had been carrying ever since she started patching the farmhands' jackets. She knotted the thread with two rapid, practiced flicks of her wrist. She murmured that it would only take a minute. He froze completely still as she stepped directly into his personal space. She pressed her fingertips against the heavy wool of his coat, right at the third button, barely 2 inches below his collarbone. She drove the needle through the fabric with the tiny, ruthless stitches her mother had taught her, anchoring the thread with the double knot her mother swore would survive the end of the world. The total silence that engulfed the entryway during that 60 seconds possessed a wildly different texture than any of the quiet moments they had shared before. This silence was breathing. It was hyper-aware of itself. When she finally snapped the thread with her teeth and took a slow step backward, she lifted her chin and looked straight into his eyes. There was something burning in his dark irises that she had only caught brief, terrifying flashes of before. It was that hidden thing that usually lived buried beneath his ledgers, the thing that occasionally swam close to the surface, but was now staring at her closer and louder than ever before. It was something she recognized deep in her bones, even if she was too terrified to give it its proper name. She swallowed hard and whispered that it was fixed. He looked at her and said, "Thank you, Cecilia." It was the very first time he had ever used her given name. No miss, no formal distance, just her name, delivered in that low, rough timbre he only used when the words meant far more than they sounded. She whispered back, "You're welcome, Arthur." It was her first time, too. He turned and practically fled out the door toward the waiting carriage. Cecilia stood rooted to the floorboards in the entryway. It wasn't until Jeb snapped the reins and the navy coat disappeared behind the line of dogwood trees that she realized she had been holding her breath so long her lungs were burning. 2 days later, an event occurred that completely blindsided Cecilia, subtly shifting the lens through which she viewed the terrifying Eleanor Lancaster. Martha had been staring out the kitchen window while the two of them chopped root vegetables for the evening stew. The older woman went completely rigid, falling into that specific, terrifying stillness she used whenever her brain was frantically trying to process something massive before she dared to speak it aloud. Cecilia wiped her hands on a towel and stepped up to the glass. Eleanor was standing out in the back garden. She wasn't doing anything. She was just standing there, dead center in the circular gravel clearing that Cecilia had spent days hacking out of the weeds. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her heavy skirt, her posture as unyielding as iron. She was staring at the climbing roses Cecilia had pruned and tied back against the stone arches. From a distance, her face carried the devastating expression of a woman who has just stumbled across a ghost she had finally convinced herself was gone forever. She stood frozen in the gravel for 5 full minutes. Then she turned and hurried back through the side door, deliberately avoiding the kitchen. Martha kept her eyes glued to the cutting board and whispered so softly it was almost to herself that Eleanor had helped Clara draw the blueprints for that garden. She muttered that the two sisters had spent an entire, joyous summer afternoon sitting over a hand-drawn map on the porch, viciously debating exactly where each rosebush should go, arguing over soil acidity and climbing vines with the desperate seriousness of women building something meant to outlast them, because it was meant to outlast them. Cecilia stood at the window, staring out at the empty, quiet garden. And in that moment, she finally understood. She understood exactly what was buried beneath Eleanor's vicious hostility in a way she hadn't grasped before. It wasn't just about Arthur moving on. It was about her little sister. It was about a patch of dirt that served as the absolute last physical place on Earth where Clara's dreams for the future still had a shape and a structure. It was the only place left where Eleanor could still clearly see what Clara had imagined her life was going to be. The revelation didn't magically make Eleanor's cruelty hurt any less, but it made it comprehensible. And that is exactly what happens when you finally stop staring at the jagged surface of a person and force yourself to look at the bleeding thing underneath. Arthur returned from the county clerk in Marion with the property deeds finally signed and sealed. He carried the exhausted relief of a man who has finally paid off a massive, grinding debt. He barely touched his dinner, a lifelong habit on days he spent dealing with lawyers, and retreated immediately to the sitting room. Martha had built a roaring fire in the massive stone hearth because the sky outside was threatening the most brutal freeze they had seen all week. Cecilia was sitting in the corner of the room, curled up in a wooden rocking chair she had quickly discovered was the most comfortable piece of furniture in the house. She had her sewing basket in her lap, using the bright, snapping light of the fire to finally tackle the fine embroidery she hadn't been able to see clearly for days. The fireplace solved the lack of light and the biting cold simultaneously, with the aggressive efficiency of a thing that knows exactly what it was built to do. On her very first night sneaking into the sitting room after supper, she had quietly asked if her presence bothered him. He had grunted a flat no, with a blunt brevity she had quickly learned to interpret as raw honesty rather than coldness. And since that night, a thick, shared quiet had settled over the room between them. It was the kind of deeply comfortable silence that serves as the loudest possible proof of mutual trust. The burning wood smelled heavily of pine sap and smoke, a scent she had completely associated with the end of the day, the hour when the furious machinery of the farm finally slept and the ancient house began to speak in its own intimate language. The groaning of the floorboards, the wind whistling through the poorly sealed window frames, the sudden crack of a pine knot exploding in the heat. Arthur was slouched in his leather wingback chair, holding a stack of cattle yields. But judging by the blank, fixed stare he was giving the paper, he had read the same paragraph at least 3 times. He was physically in the room holding the ledger, but his mind was miles away, perhaps years away. Cecilia noticed the blank stare and kept her mouth shut. He was the one who broke the silence. He spoke without any warning or preamble, using that blunt, direct tone that was his only weapon when he needed to say something terrifyingly real. He stared at the fire and said that Clara used to love the mountains in the late autumn. He murmured that she always claimed it was the time when the valley looked the most beautiful, when the brutal cold finally arrived, but the canopy was still clinging to the trees. That deep, burning gold that wasn't a tragic death, but rather a gentle, lingering goodbye between old friends who knew they would see each other again. Cecilia froze with the needle halfway through the fabric, but she deliberately kept her eyes down. She didn't want to spook the fragile moment. He kept talking. He said the garden had been her obsession from the very first day she stepped foot on the property. She had drawn out the massive grid on drafting paper, labeling every single rosebush by its Latin variety, and he had blindly agreed to pay for all of it without understanding a damn thing about horticulture. He hadn't needed to understand it. Just watching the sheer joy radiate off her face was entirely enough for him. He whispered that it was the thing he had loved most about her from the very beginning, the way she attacked her little projects with a terrifying seriousness and an explosive joy all at once. He stopped speaking. The fire snapped violently in the grate. Then he confessed that the day after she died, he had marched over to the heavy back door that led to the garden, locked the deadbolt, and never looked out that window again. He admitted that shutting it out had been much easier than he ever imagined it would be, and simultaneously far more agonizing than he would ever admit to another living soul. He said that this crushing contradiction was just one of the many things he had simply learned to carry on his back without ever trying to fix it. Cecilia finally lifted her eyes. He was staring directly into the flames with an expression she instantly recognized. It was the face of a man who had finally stopped functioning and was actively bleeding. And the difference between the two states was breathtaking. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She told him that there was an incredible amount of love still buried in that dirt. She explained that the climbing roses that had somehow survived 5 brutal winters of total neglect were the exact kind of breed that absolutely refuses to die unless they have incredibly deep, strong roots from the very beginning. And, she added softly, roots only grow that strong when the hands that plant them do so with a fierce, unwavering intention. Arthur stared silently into the fire for a long time. Then, without looking away from the flames, he muttered that she was a deeply strange woman. He said it with a tone that made it violently, undeniably clear it was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Cecilia smiled faintly and replied that this was probably very true. He turned his head and looked at her then, really looked at her for several long, agonizing seconds. And she held the gaze, refusing to look away because there was a terrifying weight to the moment that absolutely demanded to be held. It was one of those rare, heavy conversations that happen entirely through the eyes, and if you blink or look down, you lose it forever. Then he grunted, broke the stare, and aggressively returned to his cattle ledger. The fire popped loudly in the grate. Cecilia looked back down at her lap and resumed sewing with a spool of dark green thread she'd been frantically searching for all evening, only to realize it had been sitting right next to her the entire time. The hours following that night by the fire were stretched tight with an entirely new kind of tension. It wasn't the agonizing tension of awkwardness. It was the terrifying electric tension that fills a room when two people simultaneously realize a massive truth, and neither of them has any earthly idea what to do about it. Over the next few days, Arthur practically fled the house before sunrise and didn't drag himself back until well past dark. He threw himself into the farm labor with a manic, unnecessary violence that Martha bluntly labeled voluntary drowning. That specific, frantic method humans use to bury themselves in physical exhaustion when having free time to think becomes entirely too dangerous. Cecilia watched him run himself ragged and said absolutely nothing. She knew that some wounds require vast amounts of empty space to breathe, and saying the wrong word at the wrong second can permanently slam a door that had just barely started to creak open. She simply kept working. She kept hacking away at the garden. She kept fixing the ledgers. She kept drinking coffee in the kitchen with Martha, and she kept sitting on the porch at night with her sewing. She just kept being exactly who she was, because it was the only way she knew how to exist, and the only way that made any logical sense. Eleanor was preparing to leave. She had coldly informed Arthur that she would be returning to Asheville on Friday morning. Her announcement carried the distinct, heavy finality of an ending that knows exactly what it is. But before Friday could arrive, Thursday had to happen. And Thursday brought exactly what Thursday always brings: the wreckage. Eleanor cornered Cecilia in the empty parlor on Thursday morning. The younger woman was quietly polishing the heavy oak window frames with a rag. Eleanor stood in the center of the rug and delivered her strike with the brutal, direct efficiency she reserved for matters of high society warfare. She announced that she wanted to make one thing crystal clear before her carriage pulled away. She stated that she was not blind. She saw exactly what was happening inside this house. She pointed out that Arthur Vance had spent 5 years totally blind to the existence of women, and suddenly the atmosphere had shifted. She then looked Cecilia up and down and explicitly asked if her intentions toward her brother-in-law were honorable. Cecilia froze, the polishing rag gripped tightly in her fist. She turned and replied, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm, that her intentions had never been anything but honorable. She reminded Eleanor that she had arrived at this farm because of a washed-out train track and a freezing storm, not a calculated scheme, and that she had only stayed to earn her keep by doing the exhausting labor the farm desperately needed. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. She fired back that she sincerely hoped that was the truth. "Because," she hissed, "an unmarried woman with absolutely no family name, no money and no social standing, who lingers in a wealthy widower's house long past the point of necessity, practically begs for the town gossips to sharpen their knives." And if Cecilia had an ounce of common sense, she would realize that a woman's reputation is a fragile glass ornament that shatters easily and can never ever be glued back together. At that exact, miserable second, Arthur stepped through the parlor doors. He hadn't heard the beginning of the assault. He only caught the final, venomous blow. A woman's reputation is a fragile glass ornament that shatters easily. And he saw Cecilia's face. He saw the devastation ripple across her features, and because he had unconsciously spent the last month learning how to read her every expression, he understood instantly the catastrophic damage those words had just inflicted. What Arthur did next was the exact catastrophic mistake that terrified men always make when they suddenly realize they have far more to lose than they originally thought. He looked at Eleanor, deliberately refusing to meet Cecilia's eyes, and said loudly that he entirely agreed. He stated in a voice completely devoid of emotion that it was probably time to resolve the train situation, and that he would order Jeb to hitch the wagon and drive Miss Fontana down to the Marion station that very afternoon. Cecilia slowly turned her head and stared at him. He refused to hold her gaze. She didn't say a single word. There are moments in life when screaming does far less damage than absolute crushing silence, and Cecilia had learned to recognize those moments when she was a little girl. She walked out of the parlor, climbed the grand staircase with the exact same unhurried grace she used for everything, stepped into her bedroom and gently closed the door until it clicked. She stood dead center in the room. The window looked directly out over the back garden, her garden. She could see the stone arches she had painstakingly cleared of rot, and the brave yellow roses that had miraculously bloomed just last week, entirely defying her expectations. She stared at the yellow petals for a very long time. Then she opened her battered suitcase and started packing. There was very little to pack. She had arrived with practically nothing, and over the last 17 days she had acquired exactly 3 items. A faded cotton blouse Martha had forced upon her, a pair of thick wool socks, and the little notebook. The notebook was significantly heavier now than when she arrived, because the sheer beauty of the mountains, the quiet coffees with Martha and the firelight had generated a flood of thoughts that desperately needed to be written down. It all fit perfectly into the tiny bag. She folded the few garments with her usual heartbreaking precision. She slipped the notebook into the outside pocket where she could reach it easily. She was deeply hurt, yes. But it wasn't a world-ending agony. It was a familiar ache. It was the kind of pain you recognize from old wounds, the kind that hurts like hell, but you already know it won't kill you. The worst part was the sheer shock. She genuinely believed she had managed to read Arthur Vance with a fair amount of accuracy, and discovering she had a massive, blinding blind spot regarding his cowardice carried the bitter, metallic taste of a betrayal you never saw coming. She grabbed the handle of the bag. She took one final sweeping look around the room, the patchwork quilt, the braided rug, the glass window framing the garden that was finally starting to breathe again. So much heavy life left sitting in a quiet room. She walked slowly down the stairs. Right here, in this moment when everything seems decided and your heart aches, I need you to stay with me. Pause for a second, leave a comment telling me exactly what you are feeling right now. And if you have made it this far and haven't subscribed yet, this is the exact moment to do it. Because what happens next is the most beautiful part of all. You don't want to miss it. Martha was standing rigidly by the sink when Cecilia walked into the kitchen carrying the bag. The cook froze completely, which was a terrifying sight because Martha was a woman who was in perpetual motion. She stared at the bag. She stared at Cecilia. Martha asked, her voice dangerously low and trembling with a massive amount of suppressed fury contained in a very short sentence, if the girl was absolutely sure about this. Cecilia kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards and whispered that it was for the best. Martha snapped back, "Best for who?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a demand for truth carrying physical weight. Cecilia finally looked up and said softly that sometimes other people make decisions for us, and the only right thing to do is to respect them and walk away. Martha stood in silence for a span of time that lasted far longer than any silence Martha had ever tolerated in her life. Then she crossed her arms and stated with brutal clarity that respecting another person's decision is one thing, but accepting another man's pathetic cowardice and pretending it's your own destiny is something else entirely. She warned Cecilia that the two things might look the same from the outside, but they are absolutely not the same animal. Cecilia just stared at the fierce old woman. Then she whispered that she needed to leave the house right now, before she lost the nerve to walk out the door. It was a staggering piece of raw honesty that Cecilia hadn't planned on confessing, but it spilled out because it was the absolute truth, and because there were very few people on earth Cecilia offered her naked truth to, and Martha had earned her way onto that very short list. Martha lunged forward and crushed her in a massive bear hug. It was a desperate, bone-crushing embrace, the kind that screams 100 things there are no English words for. Then she released her abruptly, spun around, and aggressively attacked a cast-iron skillet on the stove, as if she desperately needed a physical object to destroy right that second. Cecilia walked out onto the front porch. It was Toby who ran to find Arthur. Toby didn't know a single detail about the psychological warfare that had just occurred in the parlor. He had simply walked past the porch, seen Miss Cecilia sitting on the wooden bench with her suitcase clutched in her lap, and panicked. He figured the boss needed to know immediately, because Toby was a boy who firmly believed the boss should be informed whenever something valuable was being removed from the property, especially something that had magically made the whole farm feel warmer in a way Toby couldn't articulate, but felt deep in his bones. Arthur was standing in the darkness of the lower cattle barn when Toby found him. He listened to the boy gasp out that Miss Cecilia was sitting on the porch with her bags packed, and he stopped breathing. The barn smelled heavily of damp earth, livestock, and oiled saddle leather. It was a scent Arthur had known since before he could form words, the scent of his entire childhood and his entire life tied to this mountain dirt. He stood paralyzed in the shadows, surrounded by everything he owned, and his brain finally started working. He had made a colossal mistake. He knew he was making it the exact second the words left his throat, and he had kept talking anyway, because there is a terrifying fraction of a second where sheer panic outruns logic, and a man's mouth executes a command before his soul can scream at him to stop. He had agreed to send her away because the night before, sitting alone in his bedroom holding a ledger he wasn't reading, he realized he was actively listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hallway before he could fall asleep. The soft rustle of her skirt, the creak of her shoes on the oak boards. He slept deeply when he heard her. He lay awake staring at the ceiling when he didn't. And that realization had crashed into him with the terrifying, unstoppable force of a runaway train. A truth that could no longer be unknown. He had said those awful words because the sheer terror of loving someone again scared him far worse than the prospect of another 50 years of isolation. Loneliness. You learn how to carry. You learn exactly how much it weighs. You map out where the sharp edges dig into your spine, and you build calluses to survive it. But a new love? You have absolutely no idea what that weighs. And that terrifying unknown is more horrifying than any familiar agony. But as he stumbled out of the barn and started a dead sprint toward the front porch, a memory flashed in his mind. He remembered what Cecilia had whispered in the firelight. Roots only grow that strong when the hands that plant them do so with a fierce, unwavering intention. And suddenly, the sentence echoed with a completely different resonance than it had that night. It sounded violently like she hadn't been talking about the damn rose bushes at all, and he had been too utterly paralyzed by his own grief to understand her in time. She was sitting on the wooden bench with her suitcase in her lap when he burst through the heavy front doors. What happened next lacked the cinematic melodrama that romance novels usually rely on for the grand climax. There was no sudden thunderstorm, no swelling orchestral music echoing off the mountains. It was just a violently ordinary Thursday morning with the pale November sun cutting sharply across the peaks and the towering pines releasing that sharp, clean scent that served as the signature of the valley. Arthur froze in the doorway, chest heaving. Cecilia remained perfectly still on the wooden bench. He gasped, his voice cracking, that he had said the wrong thing. She looked at the floorboards and softly replied that she knew. He took a step forward and confessed that he had said it purely out of terror. He offered the admission stripped of all pride, completely devoid of the careful editing men usually employ when confessing a weakness. He offered it raw, because he had finally reached the absolute edge of the cliff, where lying to himself cost far more blood than simply jumping. She lifted her eyes and looked at him. In her expression, the face he had spent weeks secretly learning how to read, he found something that shocked him. It wasn't fury. There was immense, crushing disappointment, yes, but it wasn't the kind of disappointment that builds a brick wall. It was the kind that still leaves the front door unlocked. He took another step and choked out that for 5 long years he had refused to look at the world because he firmly believed there was nothing left worth looking at. He told her he had just functioned in the most pathetic, sterile definition of the word. He did the chores, paid the bills, went where he had to go, and came back to an empty house. That was the only thing he demanded of his soul, and he had successfully brainwashed himself into believing it was enough. He stopped, struggling for breath. Then he whispered that she had crawled out of a freezing mudslide, wrapped in absolute dignity, and spent 3 weeks systematically destroying his ability to believe that surviving was the exact same thing as living. His voice broke completely on the last word. There was no theatrical sobbing, but the words tore out of his throat with the agonizing friction of something being dragged violently out of a very deep, dark hole where it had been buried alive. Cecilia sat in utter silence for a long moment. Then she spoke. She told him that there was one crucial thing he needed to get straight. She stated, her voice trembling but fierce, that she had not stumbled onto his property looking for a savior or a husband. She was literally just looking for a roof to hide under during a storm. She swore she hadn't dug up his dead garden, or played his dead piano, or fixed his ledgers, or sewn his buttons, or sat by his fire as part of some calculated scheme to trap him. She did those things because it was simply who she was, because the farm was screaming for help, and because something deep in the soil of this place and the people in it had violently collided with a massive, empty crater inside her chest that she hadn't even realized was hollow. She paused, taking a ragged breath. Then she looked him dead in the eye and told him there was something else he needed to understand about terror. She told him she understood fear intimately. She had grown up surrounded by enough tragedy and panic to recognize the scent of it on other people like a native language, and his terror made perfect logical sense to her. She swore to God she was not angry at him for being terrified. Being angry at a drowning man for flailing was just cruel. He whispered, his voice so wrecked it barely made a sound, if she was angry about anything at all. She gave a sad, tiny smile. She admitted there was a very sharp, very deep disappointment. But, she added softly, a deep disappointment is a very different thing than a reason to walk away forever. Arthur stood frozen in the doorway. The silence between them felt heavier than the mountains surrounding them, but it made no sound at all. Then he finally stepped out of the shadow of the doorway. He walked slowly across the porch until he was standing directly in front of her bench. She tilted her head back and met his eyes with that unwavering honey-amber stare that refused to look away when something real needed to be anchored. It was the exact stare he had spent a month desperately trying to ignore, only to fail in spectacular fashion. He whispered her name. Just her name. She whispered his. There were absolutely no more words required, because every single syllable that needed to bleed had already bled. What happened next was infinitely simpler and vastly more honest than any grand speech either of them could have possibly scripted. He slowly reached out his massive, calloused hand, and she laid her small, scarred hand perfectly inside it. The hands that already knew the map, from the muddy bank, from the survey blueprints, from the navy coat button. They stood like that for a long time on the wooden porch, while the pale November sun crawled higher over the Blue Ridge peaks. The pines bled their scent into the freezing air, and the stubborn yellow roses in the back garden quietly decided they were going to survive the winter after all. Eleanor watched the entire thing from the parlor window. She stood perfectly still, her manicured hands gripping the heavy oak windowsill so tightly her knuckles were white. An expression washed over her aging face that absolutely no one in the house had ever witnessed, simply because no one had ever been in the right place at the right time to catch it. It was the devastating look of a woman who suddenly recognizes a ghost she prayed she would never have to bury again, realizing she doesn't have to. She left the next morning, exactly as she had scheduled, with her massive leather trunk, her small hat box, and her armor bolted firmly in place. But right before she climbed into the carriage, she cornered Cecilia in the wide upstairs hallway. Cecilia stood her ground, radiating her usual maddening calm, having absolutely no idea what artillery was coming next. Eleanor spoke in that rigid, commanding tone she used for things that involved high treason or absolute truth. She stated that she had spent 5 agonizing years fiercely guarding Clara's ghost, because it was the only piece of her sister she had left to protect, and that holy war had turned her into a much more vicious, brittle woman than God had originally intended her to be. She explicitly stated she was not apologizing, because Eleanor Lancaster did not do apologies, but she was explaining the context so Cecilia would understand the venom had never been truly personal. She paused, swallowing hard. She muttered that Clara had been a woman who dug in the dirt and planted flowers because she fundamentally believed that a home requires beautiful things, and beautiful things require excruciating labor to survive. And, Eleanor added, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, based on the evidence in the backyard, it appeared Cecilia held the exact same religion. Cecilia looked at the terrifying old woman and whispered that she did. Eleanor gave a single sharp nod. Then she swept out the front doors and climbed into the carriage with the imperial majesty she had spent decades perfecting. But there was a microscopic shift in the way she stared at the grand stone house right before Jeb slammed the carriage door shut. It was no longer the frantic, paranoid stare of a guard dog defending a tomb. It was the exhausted, peaceful look of a woman who was finally letting go. Cecilia stood on the front steps and watched the black carriage disappear down the dirt road. Arthur stepped out of the doorway and stood silently by her shoulder. They didn't move until the dust had completely settled back onto the earth. The days that followed carried a heavy, golden quality that Cecilia hadn't felt in her bones for years, the profound peace of things finally snapping into their proper alignment. It wasn't instantly a fairy tale, because nothing involving two deeply scarred adults desperately trying to figure out how to share the exact same physical space without bleeding on each other is ever perfect right away. There were clumsy adjustments. There were heavy, echoing silences that required careful emotional navigation. There was the agonizing matter of the ivory gloves resting on Arthur's mahogany dresser. They stayed exactly where they were, because that was exactly where they belonged. Cecilia never brought them up, and Arthur never offered a frantic explanation, because there are certain ghosts you simply learn to drink coffee with. They don't require an exorcism, they just become part of the floorboards you walk on. But there were new things too. The piano was unlocked. She didn't play it every single day, and she never played it out of a forced sense of duty. But on the late afternoons, when the light hit the parlor rug at just the right angle, and there was enough empty space in the day to hold a melody, she played. Once or twice, Arthur would freeze in the hallway, listening. Then he would slowly walk in, drop into the leather chair by the fire, and she would play for an hour longer than she had planned, choosing the songs based entirely on how the chords made the air feel when someone else was finally sitting in the room to hear them. The back garden was completely, gloriously resurrected by early spring. The climbing roses responded to her violent pruning with an explosive, almost arrogant bloom, throwing out massive new vines across the stone arches with the frantic generosity of living things that finally get the water they were dying for. There were pale yellow roses Cecilia hadn't even known existed, buried deep in the dead wood, that exploded into color on a specific morning in May, as if they had just been waiting for a reason to bother. Martha kept right on being Martha, which provided the structural foundation for the entire valley. Toby spent a Sunday afternoon ripping out and rebuilding the rotted split-rail fence around the garden without anyone asking him to, because the fence was broken, and Toby was the sort of boy who fixed broken things without waiting for a written invitation. Jeb eventually started demanding Cecilia ride shotgun on the supply runs to Marion. He gruffly claimed she enjoyed the scenery and provided decent conversation without talking his ear off, which Jeb considered the absolute pinnacle of human interaction. And Arthur Vance began to discover, with the excruciating, terrifying slowness of a man learning to walk after both his legs had been crushed, that there was vastly more blood pumping through his veins than he had believed possible for the last 5 years. He discovered it in stupid tiny things, suddenly realizing he was actively inhaling the scent of the pine needles in the morning, a scent his brain had completely muted years ago. Realizing he was actually tasting Martha's coffee to see if it was too bitter, rather than just swallowing it for the caffeine. Realizing that the hours he spent trapped in his study with the ledgers were getting drastically shorter, because there was a woman sitting by the fire in the parlor, and she was worth infinitely more than the cattle yields. On a crisp afternoon the following September, Cecilia sat down and wrote another letter to Ben. This one was significantly longer than the others. She had a mountain of things to confess, and she had finally found the exact right words, because that is how words work. They only show up when the truth is finally ready to be spoken out loud. She told him all about the massive farm. She told him about the ruined garden she had clawed out of the dirt, rosebush by rosebush. She told him about Martha and her terrifying cast-iron skillet wisdom, which was the kind of genius they don't teach in law school. And she told him, choosing her syllables with agonizing care, about a man who had successfully taught himself how to survive a tragedy by amputating his own heart, and who was now slowly, painfully discovering that surviving and living are two completely different universes. She didn't write down every single detail, because there are sacred things that require years to age before they can be flattened onto paper. But she wrote enough so that Ben, who knew her soul better than anyone else breathing, could read between the ink strokes with the terrifying ease of a boy who grew up translating the silences of a sister who talked constantly but hid the heavy stuff in the pauses. Ben's reply arrived 2 weeks later, written in that massive, aggressive slant. He bluntly stated that he wanted to meet this man. He conveyed the demand in exactly 2 sentences, utilizing his terrifying ability to deliver a threat and a blessing in the exact same breath. And at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, he added that he had passed his final entrance exams for law school. Cecilia read the last sentence 3 times in a row. Then she dropped the paper into her lap and sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by that specific blinding euphoria that strikes when 2 massive joys collide in your chest at the exact same second, and your heart panics because it doesn't know which one to celebrate first, so it just fiercely explodes for both. Arthur walked into the parlor at that exact moment and caught the look on her face. He instantly recognized the expression as the good kind of shock, the blinding light that only switched on when something wonderful had broken through the door. She shoved the letter into his hands and pointed frantically at the sentence about the law school. He read it, he handed it back, and stated with the dry, flat sarcasm that she had come to recognize as his most profound language of love, that the boy was clearly a genius. She laughed, a bright, tearing sound, and proudly declared that he absolutely was. She bragged that she had practically tortured him during his study drills, and that Ben had complained violently the entire time, but had memorized the textbooks anyway. Arthur smirked and muttered that he believed both of those statements entirely. Within that tiny, ridiculous exchange lay the actual architecture of a life. It was the deeply ordinary mortar that 2 people mixed to hold their bricks together while learning how to become permanent fixtures in each other's worlds. It completely lacked theatrical drama, but it possessed massive, heavy substance. And substance is the only thing that actually survives a winter, and then time did exactly what time always does when nobody is desperately staring at the clock. It passed. 3 years washed over High Ridge Farm like 3 thick coats of expensive varnish, each passing season adding rich, glowing depth to the wood without ever covering up the grain that was already there. It was November of 1925 when this particular story reached its anchor point, not an ending, but a clearing in the woods where the chaotic noise of survival had finally settled into a rhythm that was sustainable, beautiful, and profoundly honest. Which are the only 3 things that actually matter once you've survived enough hell to know the difference. The morning broke exactly the way every mountain morning broke. The freezing, crystal-clear altitude, cold, sliced through the window panes before the sun was even up. The sharp scent of pine needles invaded every crack in the plaster as if it owned the deed to the house. And the distant, echoing complaints of the cattle proved the farmhands had been awake for hours. The kitchen smelled violently of dark coffee before anyone even hit the bottom stair. Martha was standing guard at the cast-iron stove in the exact same posture she had held for a decade, wearing an apron that looked suspiciously like the exact same one she wore the night Cecilia arrived. Cecilia padded down the wooden stairs, her dark hair still loose from her sleeping braid, her bare feet entirely immune to the freezing floorboards because the patches of morning sunlight were warm enough. The delicate blue teacup with the hand-painted flowers was waiting on the red and white checkered tablecloth. Cecilia sat down, wrapped both hands around the hot porcelain, and took the first sip with her eyes closed in that tiny, absolute ecstasy that is both insignificant and everything at the same time. Martha grunted, "Good morning," without taking her eyes off the skillet, casually adding that Mr. Arthur had ridden out to the lower pasture before dawn, but swore he'd be back before 8. Cecilia smiled over the rim of the cup and said she knew. She had woken up when he strapped on his boots. Martha snorted and noted that the girl was an incredibly light sleeper now that she was a married woman, which was exactly the opposite of how that arrangement usually worked out for folks. Cecilia took another sip and whispered that it was because, for the first time in her life, she was finally sleeping without an ounce of fear. Martha gave a single hard nod, wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who doesn't need to add a single word, because the theology of the room was already perfectly established. The back garden had exploded into a chaotic, sprawling masterpiece that made it entirely impossible to believe it had ever been a graveyard of weeds. The yellow climbing roses had aggressively conquered the entire stone archway, blooming violently from spring straight through to the early frosts. Cecilia had planted a climbing jasmine during her second year, and it was currently scaling the rear wooden fence with the patient, terrifying ambition of a plant that knows exactly how to stage a coup. In the late afternoon, when the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge peaks, the air behind the house smelled like crushed roses, sweet jasmine, and wet, rich earth. Cecilia had developed a religious habit of walking out there with her 3 o'clock coffee and just standing dead center in the gravel, silently taking inventory of the fact that it all existed. Ben's letters arrived every single month with the boring, wonderful regularity the postal service had finally achieved. He had graduated at the top of his class and was currently tearing through case files at a prestigious law firm in Raleigh, with the ruthless ambition Cecilia had recognized in him when he was 10. He had ridden the train up to the farm for Christmas in 1924, staying an entire week. He left with the stunned reverence of a city boy who had witnessed something vastly larger than he anticipated, but more importantly, he left radiating the deep, aggressive relief of a brother who recognized that Arthur Vance was actually man enough to deserve his sister. For Cecilia, that was the only blessing on earth that actually carried legal weight. Eleanor had returned for Easter that same year, stepping foot on the property for the first time since she had fled that November morning in 1922. She stayed for 3 days. On the second afternoon, she walked out into the back garden entirely alone, and she stayed out there for an hour. When she finally walked back into the kitchen, the rigid, terrifying armor was completely gone, replaced by an expression that was shockingly fragile and entirely whole. Before her carriage departed, she pulled Cecilia aside and whispered that the yellow climbing roses were Clara's absolute favorite variety, and that Clara had dragged Arthur to 3 different county nurseries before she found those specific cuttings. Cecilia had smiled softly and whispered back that she already knew, that she had dug up a folded piece of paper stuffed inside a shattered clay pot buried under the dirt, bearing the Latin name of the rose written in a loopy, careful script. Eleanor had frozen. Then she choked out a sob, whispered that it was a mercy to know the paper hadn't rotted away, and left. There are certain things that refuse to die simply because someone, somewhere, made a blood oath that they wouldn't. Arthur stomped up the porch steps just as Cecilia was pouring her second cup. His heavy leather boots were caked in freezing mud, his faded flannel jacket looked as though it had survived a war, and there was significantly more silver at his temples than there had been 3 years ago. He was 35 years old, and he looked exactly like a man who had survived every single second of it, not just marked time, but bled for it. He collapsed into the wooden chair beside hers, stretching his long legs out with the bone-deep groan of a man who has been in the saddle for hours. He sat in total silence, staring out across the frost-covered barnyard, basking in the morning quiet. It was the specific kind of silence Cecilia loved most, because it wasn't an empty void demanding to be filled with chatter. It was a heavy, rich quiet that was perfectly sufficient, exactly as it was. He slowly turned his head and looked at her. He spoke in that low, rough rumble, a voice that had shed almost all its iron plating over the years, leaving only the warm, scarred wood underneath. He muttered that there was a brand-new rose opening up on the back trellis. The deep burgundy one, the cutting Martha had stubbornly kept alive in a jar on the windowsill all last winter. Cecilia rested her chin on her hand and said she knew. She had spotted the bud yesterday afternoon. He stared at her and whispered that it was beautiful. She held his gaze. In that fleeting second, on a freezing November morning in 1925, Cecilia Vance radiated a profound, unshakable peace that her mother would have instantly recognized from heaven. It was the physical manifestation of a human soul that has finally arrived at the exact geographical coordinates where it was always meant to be. Her shoulders were loose, no longer braced for a violent blow. Her amber eyes were deep and clear, completely stripped of the defensive armor she used to wear like a second skin. It was the blinding stillness of a woman who was absolutely no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop, because she knew down to her marrow that the ground beneath her feet was finally made of solid stone. She smiled and whispered that it truly was. And they just sat there, the two of them on the porch of High Ridge Farm, while the pale winter sun dragged itself over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Surrounded by the sharp scent of pine, the cooling coffee, and the wild garden out back, bleeding burgundy and yellow against the frost, it was an entirely unremarkable morning. There was absolutely no cinematic climax, no dramatic plot twist that would ever make the county newspaper, nothing that the outside world would ever care about or even notice. It was just a freezing Tuesday on a mountain farm in 1925, with two tired people sitting on a porch. But it was also, simultaneously, the monument to every single drop of blood they had both spilled to earn the right to sit there. The love story between the broken, wealthy widower of the North Carolina mountains and the desperate young girl he pulled out of a freezing mudslide wasn't the fairy tale either of them would have ever dared to write for themselves. It didn't possess the blinding, catastrophic lightning strike of destiny that cheap romance novels always promise. Instead, it carried the heavy, callous texture of something that was built agonizingly slowly, by hand. It was built with dead rose bushes, and ink-stained ledgers, and snap buttons, and green wool shawls. It was forged in silent fires over ancient survey maps, across kitchen tables, and in the sheer terror of saying a name out loud for the very first time. It possessed the indestructible texture of a love that actually stays, which is, when the world finally burns down, the absolute only kind of story actually worth telling.